It was a regular afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood where Rachel had lived for over 5 years. With her son Lucas, the air was warm with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the soft hum of lawnmowers echoed through the streets. Rachel had just finished making lunch for Lucas when she heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling into the driveway. She knew it was Mrs. Harrington, the HOA president, someone who had never shown a shred of kindness towards them. Rachel could hear her heels kicking sharply on the pavement as she made her way up to their front door. Rachel opened it with a smile, trying to keep the peace. As always, she knew how quickly things could escalate with Mrs. Harrington, so she steeled herself for what was about to come. Mrs. Harrington was standing there glaring at Rachel with a look that could freeze water. She crossed her arms over her chest and immediately started speaking. Her tone was sharp and full of superiority. Rachel could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she listened to the words of criticism being hurled at her. She had gotten used to Mrs. Harrington's antics, but today something felt different. Something felt off, like a storm was about to break. Mrs. Harrington's words were as usual centered around the yard. The grass was too long, the flower beds were unkempt, and Rachel had failed to send in her paperwork for the upcoming HOA meeting. Rachel had been caught off guard when she had read the letter in the mail the week before. Her husband had recently passed, and she had been focused on taking care of Lucas, who had cerebral palsy. She had fallen behind on everything else, but she knew it wasn't an excuse to let the HOA come down on her and her family. The argument seemed endless as Mrs. Harrington rattled off more and more complaints. Rachel stood there silently, holding back her frustration. She wasn't in the mood for a confrontation, not today. She could already feel her heart racing in her chest. She glanced back inside the house to see Lucas sitting in his wheelchair in the living room, staring out the window. His face was soft and calm, as he always was, but Rachel could see the concern in his eyes even from where she stood. Lucas had always been more sensitive than other children, and he knew that something wasn't right. When the HOA came around, it wasn't just the looks they got from people. It was the way Mrs. Harrington made them feel like they were less than human, as if Lucas's disability was some sort of inconvenience or burden. Rachel tried her best to shield him from the harshness of the world, but it wasn't always possible, and Mrs. Harrington had a way of making them feel small. It was when Rachel tried to explain this to Mrs. Harrington that things took a sudden turn. Rachel wasn't one to back down easily, especially when it came to defending her son. She explained that she had been struggling and that Lucas's needs came first. But Mrs. Harrington wasn't having it. She scoffed at Rachel's explanation and then said something that made Rachel's blood run cold. She mentioned how there had been reports about the noise coming from their house recently, that it was becoming a disturbance to the neighbors. Rachel felt her stomach drop as she realized what Mrs. Harrington was insinuating, and just as quickly as the words left Mrs. Harrington's mouth, Rachel saw Lucas begin to struggle. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his body stiffened, and he let out a low sound of distress. Rachel immediately turned towards him, rushing to his side, trying to calm him down, but Mrs. Harrington didn't seem to care. She kept talking over Rachel's attempts to comfort her son with a voice that cut through everything. And that's when it happened. Without warning, Mrs. Harrington stepped forward and kicked Lucas's wheelchair in what Rachel could only describe as a deliberate action. She was stunned, frozen in place. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her heart thudded in her chest as she watched Mrs. Harrington turn around, as though nothing had happened, and walk away. Rachel felt her blood boil. She wanted to scream, but the only thing that kept her grounded was the thought of her son. In that moment, her protective instincts kicked in, and she knew she had to do something. But what could she do against someone like Mrs. Harrington, someone who clearly had no regard for anyone else's well-being? Rachel stood there for a moment, her mind racing. She could still hear the sound of Mrs. Harrington's heels as they clicked away on the pavement. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Lucas was still sitting in his wheelchair, his face twisted in pain, his hands gripping the sides of his chair tightly. Rachel rushed to him, her heart pounding in her chest. As she knelt down beside him, she gently placed her hands on his arms, trying to comfort him. But his body was stiff, his breathing shallow and quick. It hurt to see him like this. She could feel the anger bubbling up inside her, but it was overshadowed by her concern for Lucas. She whispered his name softly, trying to get his attention. "Lucas, baby, look at me. It's okay, Mom's here," she said, her voice shaky, but steady Lucas slowly turned his head toward her, his eyes wide and filled with fear. His lips trembled, and Rachel could see the tears starting to form. She wiped them away quickly with the back of her hand. Before pulling him into a tight hug, she held him close for a long moment, taking in the feel of him in her arms, the warmth of his body against hers. His breathing began to steady, but she could tell he was still shaken by what had happened. Rachel had always done her best to protect Lucas from the world and its cruelty, but in that moment she realized just how hard it was to shield him from everything. She couldn't stop the pain or the hurt or the injustice that people like Mrs. Harrington brought into their lives. Rachel took a deep breath. She had to stay calm for Lucas. She couldn't lose her temper, not now, not in front of him. She had always told him that people's words and actions didn't define who he was, but it was getting harder to believe that herself. She pulled back slightly so she could look him in the eye. "Sweetie, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking, "but we're not going to let her hurt you, okay? We're stronger than that, you hear me?" He nodded slowly, his eyes still filled with confusion and sadness. Rachel kissed his forehead and stood up, her body still trembling with the force of her anger. But she knew one thing for sure: Mrs. Harrington had crossed a line, and Rachel wasn't going to let her get away with it. She wasn't going to sit by and let that woman treat her son like he was less than human. With her heart still racing, Rachel walked back inside the house and grabbed the bat that she kept under the kitchen sink. It wasn't a weapon of aggression. It was something she had kept for protection, for when she felt unsafe. But today it felt like the right thing to hold onto. She wasn't sure what she was going to do with it, but she knew she needed to confront Mrs. Harrington once and for all. Rachel took one last look at Lucas before walking out the door. She didn't care what Mrs. Harrington thought of her. She didn't care about the HOA or the rules that they constantly tried to enforce. She was done being afraid of them, done allowing them to push her around. Rachel walked with purpose across the lawn, her heart still pounding in her chest. But there was a sense of determination behind each step. She wasn't just going to let this go. She wasn't going to let Mrs. Harrington get away with what she'd done. It was time for Rachel to show her that she wasn't someone to mess with, not when it came to her son. Rachel walked toward Mrs. Harrington's house with the bat in her hand. It felt heavy. But it wasn't just the weight of the object. It was the weight of everything she had been carrying for so long: the frustration, the fear, the constant need to protect Lucas from a world that didn't seem to understand him or her as his mother. As she reached Mrs. Harrington's front door, she paused for a moment and took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what she was going to say or how this confrontation was going to go, but she knew she had to do something. She couldn't let this woman continue to make their lives harder. She raised her hand and knocked sharply on the door. There was a brief silence, and then she heard the sound of footsteps coming from inside. Rachel's grip tightened on the bat as the door swung open, and there stood Mrs. Harrington, looking even more smug than usual. Rachel didn't hesitate. She stepped forward with purpose and spoke before Mrs. Harrington could say anything. "You have no right to treat my son the way you did." Rachel's voice was steady, but there was a fierceness behind her words. Mrs. Harrington blinked, as if Rachel had just slapped her. She looked down at the bat in Rachel's hand, and then back at her face. Her expression was one of confusion mixed with annoyance. Rachel could see the wheels turning in Mrs. Harrington's mind as she tried to process what was happening. But Rachel wasn't about to let her off easy this time. "Don't you ever put your hands on my son again," Rachel said, her voice calm but laced with a quiet rage. Mrs. Harrington opened her mouth to respond, but Rachel cut her off. She took a step closer and lowered her voice so only Mrs. Harrington could hear. "You think you can come into my life and my home and treat me and my son like we're nothing but an inconvenience?" Rachel's eyes never left Mrs. Harrington's. She could see the older woman's face harden. But Rachel wasn't intimidated. "I will do whatever it takes to protect my son. And if you ever lay a finger on him again, you'll regret it." Mrs. Harrington's mouth twisted into a thin, tight-lipped smile. As she took a step back, she was clearly trying to regain control of the situation. But Rachel could see the cracks in her composure. She was rattled, and that gave Rachel a sense of power she had never felt before. Mrs. Harrington finally spoke, her voice low and dripping with condescension. "You're a real piece of work, you know that, don't you?" Rachel stood her ground and narrowed her eyes. "I'm not going to stand here and let you belittle me or my son ever again." Rachel took another step forward, letting the bat rest loosely at her side. You're nothing more than a bully hiding behind rules and regulations." She said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. Mrs. Harrington's face flushed a deep shade of red, and Rachel could see the fury building behind her eyes. But Rachel was unshaken. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't scared of her anymore. Lucas needed her to stand up for him, and she was done being silent, done being afraid of the woman who thought she could control their lives. Rachel raised her chin slightly, the bat now resting in her hand with a steady grip. "I'm going to make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows what you did and what kind of person you are," she said, her words deliberate and slow. Mrs. Harrington's expression faltered for just a moment, but in that brief second Rachel knew she had made an impact. The older woman wasn't as powerful as she wanted everyone to think, and for the first time Rachel could see her weakness. She turned on her heel and started to walk away. But then Mrs. Harrington spoke again in a voice barely above a whisper. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret this." Rachel stopped in her tracks, and without turning around she responded with quiet conviction, "I won't regret standing up for my son." Rachel felt the weight of the bat in her hand again, but this time it felt lighter somehow, as if she was holding something more than just an object, something that represented her strength, her resolve, and her love for her son. Rachel walked back toward her house. Her heart was still pounding, but the anger that had gripped her earlier had begun to fade. Her grip on the bat loosened, and she could feel the cool breeze on her face, as if the air itself was reminding her to breathe. Lucas was sitting in his wheelchair, still in the same spot he had been before when Rachel had rushed out of the house to confront Mrs. Harrington. But this time he looked up as she approached, his eyes searching her face. Rachel smiled at him. As she knelt down beside him, she brushed a few strands of his hair out of his eyes and kissed his forehead. "You okay, sweetie?" she asked softly. Lucas nodded slowly, his eyes still full of questions, but there was a small smile tugging at his lips. He didn't fully understand what had just happened, but Rachel could tell. He could sense the change in the air. The tension that had been there earlier was gone, and for the first time in a long while he looked like he could relax. Rachel could feel the weight of the past few hours lifting off her shoulders as she hugged him tightly. Everything was still so raw, but they had made it through together, and that was what mattered. She would never let anyone hurt him again. Rachel took a deep breath and stood up. She glanced at the bat in her hand, and then set it down gently on the table by the door. It had served its purpose for now, but she knew there was more work to be done. Rachel didn't want to live in fear anymore. She didn't want to feel like she had to hide or shrink in the face of people like Mrs. Harrington. She wanted to be free. She wanted to stand tall and show her son that he was worth defending, that he was worth everything she had to give. She knew that the battle wasn't over. Mrs. Harrington would come back, and the HOA wouldn't just forget about what had happened. But Rachel wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't going to let them push her around or make her feel small. She was ready for whatever came next. That night, as Rachel tucked Lucas into bed, she sat beside him and stroked his hair. She told him stories about brave knights and powerful queens, about people who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. Lucas's eyes began to flutter as he drifted off to sleep, but before he closed them completely, he whispered something that made Rachel's heart swell with pride. "I love you, Mom," he said, his voice small but filled with so much meaning. Rachel kissed his forehead again and whispered back, "I love you too, sweetie, and I'll always protect you, always." She knew there would be more struggles ahead, but she also knew that they were a team. Rachel didn't need anyone else's approval or validation. She didn't need to conform to the standards set by people like Mrs. Harrington. All she needed was her son and her love for him. Rachel sat there for a while after Lucas had fallen asleep, her mind still racing with thoughts of the confrontation, the future, and the people who would try to tear them down. But in that moment she felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. She was no longer afraid of the HOA or of Mrs. Harrington. She was stronger than they would ever realize, and she wasn't going to let anything take that from her or from Lucas. The next morning Rachel woke up early. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a soft glow through the curtains. She had barely slept the night before, but she knew that today was important. She needed to get everything together. She wasn't going to wait for the HOA to make their next move, or for Mrs. Harrington to come back to her door. Rachel moved quietly through the house, making coffee and preparing breakfast for Lucas. As she worked, she thought about the day ahead. The HOA meeting was scheduled for later that afternoon, and she was determined to be ready for it. Rachel knew Mrs. Harrington would be there, and she would probably try to make Rachel out to be the villain in front of everyone, but Rachel wasn't worried anymore. She had seen how easily Mrs. Harrington had crumbled in their confrontation, and it made her realize something important. She wasn't just a victim, she was strong, and she had the power to stand up for herself and Lucas. No matter what, she had already taken the first step. Now it was time to take the next. Rachel made sure Lucas had his favorite breakfast, oatmeal with a bit of honey and fruit, before helping him get dressed for the day. As she did so, she couldn't help but smile at the way his eyes sparkled when he looked up at her. His trust in her was unwavering, and that was all she needed to keep moving forward. They ate together quietly, and Rachel made sure Lucas was comfortable in his wheelchair. Before she set out to get ready for the meeting, she had a plan. She wasn't going to sit back and let Mrs. Harrington or anyone else push her around anymore. Rachel pulled on a simple blouse and jeans. She didn't need anything fancy, but she made sure she looked confident and put together. She had learned over the years that appearances mattered sometimes, especially when people like Mrs. Harrington were watching. She grabbed her purse and the folder she had prepared the night before. It was filled with documents about her son's condition, the medical records and letters from his doctors that explained the level of care he needed, the things she hadn't been able to share with the HOA until now. She knew that the truth could be a powerful weapon, and it was time to show everyone that they had no idea what her life was really like. Before heading out, she made one final check on Lucas to make sure he had everything he needed for the day. He was watching cartoons quietly, but his eyes met hers, and he gave her a small but reassuring smile. She kissed him on the cheek and promised she'd be back soon. As Rachel walked out the door, she felt the familiar weight of determination settle in her chest. She wasn't just going to the meeting to defend herself or Lucas. She was going to stand up for all the other families who had been silenced by the HOA over the years, families who were too afraid to speak up against the authority of people like Mrs. Harrington. Rachel had spent too much time hiding and staying quiet. It was time to stop. She had the truth on her side, and she wasn't afraid to share it with anyone. She drove to the community center, where the meeting was being held. The streets were quiet this early in the morning, but Rachel's nerves were buzzing with anticipation. She didn't know exactly what would happen once she walked into that room, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Lucas and how much she wanted him to know that his mom was always going to fight for him and for what was right. She wasn't going to let anyone make him feel like he was less than anyone else anymore. Not Mrs. Harrington, not anyone. When Rachel arrived at the community center, the parking lot was already filling up with cars. She took a deep breath as she stepped out of the car. Her palms were sweaty, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She walked toward the building with quick, purposeful steps, her mind racing through the things she wanted to say, the points she needed to make. She wasn't going to let anyone intimidate her anymore. Not Mrs. Harrington, not the rest of the HOA board. As she entered the building, she was greeted by a few familiar faces, some neighbors who had lived in the community for years. They smiled politely, but Rachel could see the curiosity in their eyes. They had heard the rumors about her and Lucas, but they had never really gotten involved with the HOA drama. Rachel didn't pay them much attention. As she made her way to the meeting room, her heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed through the door with confidence. When she stepped into the room, she saw Mrs. Harrington sitting at the front, her posture straight and her gaze sharp. She was clearly ready to make a spectacle of Rachel. The rest of the HOA members were seated around the table. Many of them looked at Rachel with cold indifference, but there were a few who seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. Rachel stood at the back of the room for a moment, gathering herself. Before she took a seat at the table, she set the folder she had prepared in front of her and made sure everyone could see it. Her eyes met Mrs. Harrington's for a brief moment, and the tension in the air was palpable. Mrs. Harrington shot her a quick look of disdain, but Rachel held her ground. And when the meeting began, Mrs. Harrington wasted no time launching into her complaints about Rachel's yard, about the noise from their house, and about how Rachel had failed to comply with the rules of the neighborhood. Rachel listened quietly at first. She knew this was going to be difficult, but she was ready for it. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up slowly and cleared her throat. "I'm not here to make excuses," she began, her voice calm and steady. "I'm here because I need you all to understand what my life is really like." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. And then she continued, "My son Lucas has cerebral palsy, and he needs a level of care that most people don't understand." Rachel could feel the eyes of the room on her now. Some of them were surprised, others looked skeptical. But she didn't care. She was going to tell them everything she had been holding inside for so long. She went on to explain how the constant stress of caring for Lucas had made it difficult to keep up with the demands of the HOA, how she had done her best, but sometimes things slipped through the cracks, and how Mrs. Harrington's behavior had only made things harder. She spoke about how Lucas's condition often caused him to make noises that weren't always easy to explain, but that didn't make him any less worthy of respect and love. She explained how hard it was to be a single mother to a child with such special needs, and how Mrs. Harrington's attack on him had made it all the more painful. Rachel felt her voice shaking with emotion, but she didn't back down. "I am not a bad neighbor. I am not a bad mother. I am doing the best I can, and all I ask is that you show me and my son some kindness." She finished her speech and sat back down. The room was silent for a moment, and Rachel felt the weight of all their gazes on her. She could hear the whispers starting in the background. Some of the people were murmuring amongst themselves. She had no idea what they were saying, but she was done being afraid of their judgment. She had spoken her truth, and that was enough. Mrs. Harrington had not expected Rachel to speak like that, and Rachel could see the surprise in her eyes. But the woman quickly regained her composure and started to argue back. She tried to twist Rachel's words and make it sound like she was just making excuses. But Rachel wasn't going to let her get away with it. She wasn't backing down. She was ready for the fight, and she wasn't afraid of Mrs. Harrington anymore. Rachel could feel the tension building in the room as Mrs. Harrington began to speak again, her voice sharp and filled with venom. She tried to twist Rachel's words, just as she had expected. But Rachel wasn't going to let her manipulate the situation any longer. She stood up slowly and faced Mrs. Harrington with a calm expression. But inside her heart was racing. She knew she had to stand her ground. She couldn't let this woman control the narrative anymore. Mrs. Harrington was talking about the importance of maintaining order in the neighborhood, about how rules were rules, and everyone needed to follow them. Rachel shook her head slightly. "I understand that, but when rules are used to hurt people, they're not serving their purpose," she said, her voice steady but firm. She saw a few of the other HOA members nodding as she spoke, and it gave her a little hope. Mrs. Harrington tried to interrupt, but Rachel raised her hand just slightly to stop her. "You don't understand what it's like to live with a child who needs constant care. You don't understand the pressure, the exhaustion, the loneliness. I can't keep up with everything all the time. I do my best, but sometimes things slip through the cracks." Rachel paused, letting the words hang in the air, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but just as powerful. "I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for understanding. I'm asking for compassion." Rachel could see some of the members around the table looking uncomfortable with Mrs. Harrington's sharp words, but they were reluctant to take a side. Some of them shifted in their seats and avoided eye contact, but a few others looked at Rachel with something resembling sympathy. Mrs. Harrington was visibly growing frustrated, and she shot Rachel a look that could have burned a hole in the wall. But Rachel wasn't afraid anymore. The more Mrs. Harrington ranted, the more Rachel realized that this was a battle of hearts and minds, and she was starting to win some of them over. She wasn't just defending herself, she was defending everyone who had ever been dismissed or belittled by the HOA. She was fighting for all the families who had to hide their struggles to fit into a narrow box that didn't allow for imperfection. Rachel took a deep breath and continued, "But this isn't just about me and Lucas. This is about creating a community where we lift each other up, not tear each other down." She looked around the room, making sure to meet everyone's eyes. "One by one, we all have struggles, things that others don't see, things that aren't always easy to talk about, but we don't have to face them alone." Rachel could see some of the members starting to soften, and she knew she had hit a nerve. She wasn't going to let Mrs. Harrington's words tear down what she had built. She had worked too hard for this life. She had fought too many battles to give up now. Mrs. Harrington looked furious, her hands clenched into fists, as she tried to control her temper. But Rachel wasn't done. She still had more to say. She leaned forward slightly and spoke directly to the board. "You don't know me, you don't know what I've been through, but you don't get to decide who deserves respect And who doesn't? Rachel's words echoed in the silence that followed, and she could see the looks of realization spreading across the room. There were no more interruptions, just the quiet buzz of people processing what had just been said. Rachel sat back down and looked at Lucas's folder sitting on the table next to her. She had one more thing to say. I've brought Lucas's medical records here with me, and I'm happy to share them with anyone who wants to know more about what he needs. Rachel said, her voice clear and confident. She wasn't going to leave anything to chance. She wasn't going to let them continue to look at her son, through a lens of ignorance and prejudice. She was ready to be open, ready to share the reality of their lives, so they could no longer hide behind their misconceptions. The room was still and quiet for a long moment. Rachel could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. But she didn't look away from the board members. She kept her eyes steady and her posture strong. She had said everything she needed to say now. It was up to them to decide whether they would listen or not. Mrs. Harrington seemed to be fighting to keep control of her composure, her jaw clenched tight, as if she were trying to hold back the words that were burning on the tip of her tongue. But she said nothing. The other board members were murmuring among themselves quietly. Rachel could hear snippets of their conversation. Some of them seemed to be agreeing with what she had said, others sounded uncertain. Rachel couldn't tell if they were beginning to understand, or if they were just trying to figure out how to get out of the situation without making waves. But she didn't care at that moment. She had made her point, and she wasn't backing down. The room seemed to stretch on forever, as everyone processed what had been said. And for the first time since she had entered, Rachel didn't feel like the outsider. She didn't feel like the one in the wrong. She felt like she belonged here just as much as anyone else. Mrs. Harrington finally broke the silence, her voice dripping with disdain. That's all well and good, she said, but it doesn't change the fact that you've been breaking the rules and that your behavior affects the rest of the neighborhood. Rachel didn't flinch. She had expected this kind of response from Mrs. Harrington. She wasn't going to let her derail everything. Rachel leaned forward slightly and looked her straight in the eye. You're right. I haven't followed every rule. I've made mistakes, and I'm sorry for that. But you don't get to hold that over my head when I've done everything I can to care for my son, she said, her voice steady, but with an edge. I'm not perfect, and I'm not asking for perfection from anyone else. But I will not apologize for being a mother who's doing her best. Rachel could feel the air shift in the room. A few people were nodding, others were watching intently, waiting to see how things would play out. But Mrs. Harrington wasn't finished, yet she opened her mouth to speak again. But this time one of the other board members interrupted. Rachel had noticed him before, but now he was standing up and looking at Mrs. Harrington with a stern expression. Enough, he said, his voice firm. Mrs. Harrington turned to him, surprised by the sudden interruption. He continued, we've heard everything we need to hear, and it's clear that this isn't just about rules. This is about someone who's struggling to make it through each day and trying to care for their child. He looked around the room and made sure everyone was listening. I think it's time we stop pretending that everything is black and white, he said, his voice quieter, but no less powerful. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this kind of support, and for a moment she felt a weight lift from her chest. She had been so focused on fighting that she hadn't realized how much she needed someone to stand with her. The room fell into another heavy silence. But this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of judgment or condemnation. It was the silence of understanding. The man who had spoken cleared his throat and continued, I'm not saying we should ignore the rules, but I think we need to take a step back and ask ourselves what kind of community we want to be. Rachel's heart raced as she looked at the board members. Some of them were nodding, others still seemed unsure, but the man's words had planted a seed, and Rachel could feel something shift in the room. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone anymore. She had people on her side, people who saw her as more than just a rule breaker, more than just a woman who didn't fit into their mold. She was a mother doing the best she could, and that was enough. Mrs. Harrington was visibly fuming, but she didn't speak again. The silence stretched on as the board members discussed what to do next. Rachel sat there watching and waiting. She wasn't sure how this would all play out, but she knew that this was a turning point, that no matter what happened, she had fought for her son and for herself, and that was a victory in itself. The discussion in the room continued for what felt like hours. Rachel could feel her body growing tense as the conversation dragged on. Some of the board members were still talking about rules and how they needed to be enforced, while others seemed to be considering Rachel's words more seriously. But Mrs. Harrington was having none of it. She kept interrupting, trying to steer the conversation back to her original point, that Rachel was in violation of the HOA guidelines, that Rachel wasn't a good neighbor, that Rachel had somehow ruined the peacefulness of the neighborhood. But this time it was different. The voices in the room were starting to shift. Rachel could hear the change. She wasn't the only one speaking up now. There were murmurs of agreement from other members. Some of them seemed to be questioning the way things had always been done. Others were beginning to ask what had been left unsaid. Until now, Rachel kept her eyes on the group, feeling a sense of quiet triumph, as the room seemed to shift away from Mrs. Harrington's narrative and toward a more balanced conversation. She had done it. She had opened the door for people to think differently, for people to see things from a different perspective. And it was starting to work. The man who had spoken up earlier cleared his throat again and stood up. We've heard a lot of arguments today, and I think it's time we made a decision, he said, his voice firm and resolute. He looked at Rachel and then at the rest of the group. But before he could say anything else, Mrs. Harrington jumped in with a snide remark. "You can't be serious," she said, glaring at him. "There's no way we can just ignore the rules. Rachel has broken them. And now she wants us to just look the other way. That's not how this works." Rachel looked at Mrs. Harrington and then back at the man who was speaking. He met her eyes briefly, and she saw a flicker of determination in his gaze. The others around the table were quiet now, waiting to hear what he would say. He turned to the rest of the board members and spoke in a calm but commanding tone. "I think it's time we consider a new approach," he said, addressing everyone. "We need to take into account not just the rules, but also the reality of people's lives. We can't continue to treat every infraction like it's the end of the world. We need to be a community that looks out for each other, not one that punishes people for every small mistake." Rachel's heart was racing, but she couldn't help the small spark of hope that flickered inside her. This was the moment. This was the change she had been fighting for. The board members were looking at each other now. Some were nodding, some were still hesitant. But Rachel could see that the tide was turning. Mrs. Harrington looked furious, her face bright red, as she opened her mouth to speak again. But the man held up a hand and calmly stopped her. "That's enough," he said. And for the first time in the meeting, Mrs. Harrington was quiet. The man turned back to the board and said, "We're going to take a vote on this." He looked around the table at everyone. "Are we a community that works together? Or are we a group that punishes people for every misstep?" Rachel held her breath. As the room fell silent, the tension was thick. But she wasn't afraid anymore, not after everything she had said, not after the support she had received from some of the board members. She knew she had done everything she could, and now it was up to them to decide. He nodded to the group. "Let's vote," he said. It was time to make a choice. The room was eerily quiet as the vote was about to begin. Rachel could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The air around her seemed to hold its breath. As the board members glanced at one another, weighing their options, Rachel's eyes flitted from one person to the next, wondering who would side with her, who would see the truth of what she had said, and who would side with Mrs. Harrington. The man who had spoken first was looking at the others with a calm expression, as if he had already made up his mind. But Rachel could see the uncertainty in the eyes of a few of the other members. Some looked down at their hands, others stared at the table in front of them. But all of them were silent. Mrs. Harrington's glare was fixed on the man who had called for the vote. She was clearly seething with anger, her lips pressed tightly together. But she remained silent for now. As the vote began, one by one, each board member raised their hand to cast their vote. Rachel held her breath, waiting for each decision to be made. The first vote was quick, the second a little slower. Rachel watched carefully, and when the third person raised their hand in her favor, her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe it. They were actually listening. They were actually considering what she had said. The votes continued to be counted, and Rachel felt her stomach twist with anticipation. As the final vote was cast, the man who had spoken up earlier looked at Rachel, then at the rest of the room, and gave a small nod. It was over. The vote was done, and Rachel had won. Mrs. Harrington's face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. But Rachel couldn't bring herself to feel any sympathy for her, not now, not after everything that had happened. The man who had led the vote stood up and addressed the room. "It's clear from the votes that we are not going to pursue any further action against Rachel and her family," he said, his voice steady and calm. Mrs. Harrington seemed to shrink in her chair, her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the decision had crushed her spirit. Rachel took a deep breath. She had done it, she had stood her ground. And she had won her fight, not just for herself, but for her son too. The other board members began to murmur amongst themselves. But Rachel didn't hear them. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. She had been so sure she was going to lose. But now it felt like the world had shifted in her favor. The man who had stood up for her turned to her and gave a small smile. "You were right," he said quietly. "We need to be a community that supports each other." Rachel nodded slowly, her chest tightening with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and turned back to the board. The meeting was over, and as Rachel stood up to leave, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. But it wasn't just relief. It was the feeling of finally being seen, finally being heard. She had done what she had set out to do. She had made them see that Lucas and her were worthy of respect, just as much as anyone else. Mrs. Harrington was still sitting there at the table, her hands clenched into fists. But she didn't say anything as Rachel walked past her. Rachel didn't need to say anything either. She had won the battle. She had taken the first step toward changing the way people saw her and her son. And that was enough. As she walked out of the building, she felt a new sense of freedom. It wasn't just a victory over Mrs. Harrington or the HOA. It was a victory for all the families who had been silenced, all the parents who had struggled to make ends meet and keep their children safe and happy. Rachel knew this wasn't the end, but it was a new beginning for her and for Lucas, and that was all she needed.